Greetings. In this video, we're going to be looking at this 12-marker question. Examine the different ways in which the US President and the UK Prime Minister appoint their cabinets. Let's just talk about the basics. It's a 12-marker, so we don't need an introduction and we don't need a conclusion. There is no AO3 marks, so there's no evaluation. We're not trying to persuade the examiner of a particular point of view. But there is analysis, so we need to kind of show what the different ways are and perhaps the impact that they have or why those differences might exist. So we need to go further than just facts. We need to use examples. We're probably going to be aiming for 2 or 3 sections. Ideally, we would go for 3. And we need to be going between the US and the UK. So what we don't want to be doing is saying this is what the US does and this is what the UK does, although that is a valid way of answering the question. But because this is a comparative question, if you do that way, your comparison is not going to be strong. Whereas if you go US to UK, US to UK, US to UK, or whichever way around, you will be constantly making comparisons between the two, which is the important thing. So the question says, examine the different ways in which they appoint their cabinet. So any similarities are irrelevant and literally will score no marks and will get no credit at all. So it's not like they score less marks, they are irrelevant, and the examiner will mentally kind of put a line through them and you won't be scoring anything for them. So let's go through some of the things that you might have put in, and I've going to show you quite a few, and some of them you could kind of put together into a particular section and make a bigger section. Some of them obviously you can separate out. You wouldn't need to include them all. Like I said, 3 is probably what you're looking for. So first of all, the US cabinet must come from Parliament in some way. Every member of the cabinet is either in the House of Lords or is in the House of Commons. Most of them are House of Commons. In the US is the complete opposite in that they must not come from Congress, and if they do, they have to resign their post, like someone like Jeff Sessions did when he joined Trump's cabinet back in 2016. So use examples to kind of back that one up. And this means that the kinds of people that end up in the cabinet also end up being very different as well, and I'll come back to that point later with a follow-up that you might want to use as your analysis. Once they have been chosen, there is then a confirmation process in the US, using the Senate, but in the UK there is none. Once the Prime Minister says, it is you, that is it. That is the confirmation process. The Prime Minister has confirmed it. So there's a very big difference here in terms of how you actually kind of get in through the selection process in the UK. In the US, you're going to be questioned. You're going to be investigated. Senators will vote on whether they kind of approve you or not, whereas the Prime Minister solely has the power of of patronage in the UK. There are different pressures on balancing the demographics. Like in the UK, there is an there is an expectation that a Prime Minister will try and balance viewpoints. So Brexit and non-Brexit, thinking about Theresa May. Tony Blair balanced kind of old Labour and new Labour. Even Boris Johnson, in his more recent cabinet, has tried to kind of balance out kind of one nation and kind of hardliners. In the US, there's more of a pressure to kind of balance your demographics in terms of like maybe a gender or a racial balance. Donald Trump, of course, has kind of pushed that to one side because he has the whitest cabinet for a long time. But in the UK, there is a pressure on demographics, but it's perhaps less prominent than dividing up different kind of views. In the US, a member of the cabinet can be fired at any time with very little consequences. If Donald Trump wants to get rid of someone, he just does it. And yes, it's a news story for a couple of days, but that's it. The UK, they can fire them, but there will be consequences because that member of Parliament will then go onto the back benches. They could be a potential leadership contender. They are allowed to make a resignation speech, which Sajid Javid did the other day in Parliament. There are more consequences for removing members. Linking to the first point, the US can appoint from anywhere, business, science, expertise, whereas the UK normally recruits exclusively from the shadow cabinet and if they're coming into government, and certainly from their own party. So the field is narrower, and this also may affect the expertise that is brought to a particular job. I'm reading John Burko's autobiography at the moment, and he gets pushed into departments that he has no interest in at all, and yet he ends up being the representative for it. So whereas in the US, you would definitely get someone that is interested in a particular issue heading up that particular department. Now, the stuff that's about to appear in red is more of your analysis. So it's not necessarily your initial point, but it's going to develop the points at the top. So the US cabinet is not full of political rivals in the way the UK one is. In the US, Donald Trump has never got to worry about Jeff Sessions or Michael Cohen perhaps being a political rival, because they're not necessarily political in many cases, or Jeff Sessions might be an exception. Whereas Boris Johnson does have to worry perhaps about Dominic Raab, or think about Theresa May had to worry about Boris Johnson, had to worry about Michael Gove, Tony Blair had to worry about Gordon Brown. This affects how they may appoint their cabinet. So you're going to use these points to develop the initial points. These aren't necessarily points on their own. They're going to help you get the AO2 for the first one. The UK Prime Minister is simply the first among equals, the leader of the largest party, which can be removed by the party at any time, whereas the US President has their own electoral mandate, which will then impact this idea of that how the US President can fire them at any time. The fact that there are different pressures on them in terms of who they appoint. The US cabinet meet very rarely. Remember, Reagan very rarely kind of saw his cabinet, but the UK cabinet meets weekly and they all have input on collective decisions. This, of course, may impact who is chosen and why they are chosen, and then connect to, again, the other arguments above. And lastly, the US cabinet could be strangers. There was a famous story where Ronald Reagan didn't recognize his own housing minister, whereas the UK cabinet are all going to be close colleagues, and they're going to have known each other probably for many years in Parliament. And of course, the UK cabinet will have voted probably for that particular prime minister, which again will connect to things about different pressures on balancing the demographics and who he might choose or not choose to kind of appoint, or who will fire, and so on. So there's lots to talk about there. So your essay should hopefully take some of these ideas, put them into ideally 3 paragraphs, and you would use some of the red stuff to extend some of the black stuff in there. There are other points that you can put in, and anything valid is given credit, but ideally you want a breadth of ideas, a breadth of examples, and a breadth of analysis. Hope that was useful. Now you can go and check out your own individual video to see how you did.